Welcome to CSI Chat, where every topic's fair game. From finance to mysteries, we'll never be the same. Our hosts an accountant with a knack for a joke. We'll dive into the details and laugh until we choke. CSI Chat, where the numbers beat the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun.
Okay, well, we are very lucky today to be joined by, Captain Michael Abrashoff. Mike, thank you very much for taking the time to talk leadership.
Happy to be here.
I'm going to give a little bit of background on Mike before we get into the details to give everybody some perspective. But some background on Mike is at the age of 36. He was selected to be the commander of the USS Benfold and was the most junior commanding officer in the Pacific Fleet, and then turned the ship into one of the highest performing ships in the U.S. Navy, if not the highest performing ship in the U.S. Navy. He is the author of the book, It's Your Ship, Management Techniques from the Best Damn Ship in the Navy, which I would highly recommend people take a read of. It's a terrific book. And since leaving the Navy, Mike has worked with over 1,200 organizations instilling leadership initiatives at every level. So he is a leadership expert, if there ever was one. And Mike, like I said, I've really enjoyed your book. Many of the leadership practices that you preach in your book are practices that we do our best to employ at CSI. But, before we get into the leadership, one of the other things that I found really interesting about your book is kind of life on a battleship. And more specifically, you talk about this process of firing a Tomahawk missile off the deck of a battleship, which sounds to be pretty, quite the event. Maybe before we get into leadership, you could just give us some sense of what it's actually like to fire a Tomahawk missile off the deck of a battleship.
Well, as you might expect, a lot goes into it. This missile had to fly 1,000 miles and have a 98% probability of landing within 25 feet of its target.
Wow.
And it's being programmed by young men and women who are 20, 21 years old. And so it requires an enormous amount of precision, an enormous amount of training. And so we're constantly practicing our proficiency in Tomahawk cruise missiles. And what's interesting is when I had command of the ship, we also have a tremendous air search radar. We could track a bird at 50 miles and shoot it down with our radar. And with their radar, it's about protecting the aircraft carrier from enemy aircraft. But there's also 3 or 4 other ships with the same radar, all fighting to be that sexy air defense platform for the battle group. And I remember thinking, I'm not going to fight that battle. I'm going to be the premier Tomahawk cruise missile ship in the Navy. And so that's what we focused on. And lo and behold, when we get to the Middle East, there was no air threat to our aircraft carrier. But what was needed was a ship that was proficient with Tomahawk cruise missiles. So we were loaded out with the most up-to-date and sexy cruise missiles. And then we did our time in the Persian Gulf, and it was time for us to leave. And I'm told the Secretary of Defense questioned whether Benfold should be allowed to leave the Middle East or not, that we were so valuable as a Tomahawk missile platform that we should be extended. So anyway,
Yeah.
Fortunately, it never happened, and we were able to get to Australia for our port visits, which was very important to our sailors. But anyway, that's my story on Tomahawk cruise missiles.
Yeah, it's cool. Well, the other thing I realized too is that, some of the information about Tomahawk missiles is from the 1990s. And I can just imagine what technology is like today. Is that the Tomahawk missile back then was, version 1 or whatever. I can't imagine what it looks like today. It must be, those numbers must have increased because the technology behind that is just incredible. Like it's just absolutely amazing. So
it's the best technology we have to offer.
Yeah. So before we get into the Benfold itself, Mike, I'd love to just get your perspective. Again, you deal with organizations all over the world, and I'd just love to get your perspective on the state of the workforce today. We're coming out of, we had COVID, everybody was, kind of forced to work from home for a period of time. We've got people now transitioning back into the office, hybrid workforce. You've got technology is kind of front and center. I just want to just love to get your perspective. Is that when you talk to the average employee, what's their perspective, and what are the things that kind of make them either happy or not happy at their current job? Because retaining talent, as you note in your book, is super important. The cost of replacing talent is extremely expensive. And I just love to get your perspective on the state, because I think if people thought, well, if I just pay my people more, it's going to create, happiness and make them stay. But I don't think that's the case. I don't think it's necessarily money that drives them. But again, I'd love to get your perspective on what you're hearing today.
So the number one question I get is how to deal with the younger generations. And that's on top of all the other issues that you just brought up.
Yep.
And I'll never forget, I interviewed every sailor individually, all 310 of them. I got to know their name, their spouse's name, their children's name, what their goals were while they were in the Navy. And I'll never forget, in one of the earliest interviews, an engineer came in and asked me how to do a procedure. And I remember thinking, you're the engineer, why are you asking me how to do this? And then it hit me, he wanted me to tell him how to do it so that if it didn't work out, he could just say, I was just doing what I was told to do and not take accountability for the results. And so I thought for a second, I said to him, what do you think? If you own this ship, how would you do this? And he said, well, if I own this ship, this is what I would do. And I said, do it. And he turned in flawless performance and better performance than if I told him how to do it, because he owned it. And when we talk about working with younger generations today, they don't want to be told how to do things. Lay out the requirements for them, let them figure it out, and hopefully they'll be perfect. But you know what? I'm not perfect. None of us are perfect. We're all going to come up short time and time again. Don't shoot them. Don't crucify them. Say, what did you learn? And what would you do differently if you see this again in the future? And that's how they gain wisdom. That's how they gain confidence. And that's how they start taking accountability and pride, because they're the ones that came up with the solution. So the key is to, my generation, we were told to do something, we saluted and we did it, never question it. But the younger generation wants to know why.
Yeah.
And it's in it for them. And so we need to be better communicators to them, why it's important, but most importantly, why it's in their own best interest. And so that's, how I chose to connect with younger people. But there was also an issue of retention. In the quarter before I took command of the ship, our retention rate was 8%. And the admiral said to me, Mike, you can't do anything about it because they're leaving because of our low pay. Well, I agree, we don't pay our people enough. I'd love to pay them more. But I did exit surveys to confirm that pay was the number one reason why they were leaving. And sure, it was important, but it was only number 5 on the list of reasons why they were walking out the door. Number 1 was they feel like they were being treated with respect in the workplace. Number 2, they didn't feel like they were being listened to. Number 3, they didn't feel like they were getting the training they needed to do a great job. And number 4, they didn't feel like they were being groomed for increased positions of responsibility. And, I can't do anything about pay, but I can focus on those top 4 issues because it doesn't cost taxpayers a dime, and I don't need to get anybody's permission to do it. So that's what I focused on because it was one of the things I could influence. And what happened my last year in command, our retention rate was almost 100%. We had the highest retention of any ship in the Navy that year. And because the team stayed together, we got to a higher level of performance. And at the end of the day, it's what this is all about: performance and controlling your own destiny.
Yeah. And the beauty, especially in the Navy, is that from a performance perspective, like there's some pretty solid metrics that you can measure that, you have battled just, battles with other groups and things like that on a computer, whatever, simulations and things like that. There's a whole bunch of metrics that you can leverage that basically prove out your point.
We are measured on everything. What people don't realize, a ship is a small city.
Yeah.
And only do I have to put ordnance on target, but I've got to feed 310 people, and we get inspected on our food service operations. I've got to do laundry for 310 people. We get inspected on our laundry. I even have to get every sailor a dental exam every year. And if I don't get 100% dental exams within the year, I get dinged on our dental readiness. And then if they have a cavity, I get even lower on the dental rating. So every aspect of our life on the ship is measured, and we are held to a standard. And so um, all those things go into the health of a ship and the culture in being able to deliver uh, on our promise. And so you have to do it all, and we're getting measured constantly.
So when you walked into the USS Benfold and assumed command, at what point did you realize things weren't okay? Like, when you walk in that ship, you lead your book on talking about how there's the transition and everybody gets up and there's a big ceremony. Everything maybe it's like one of those things, everything looks good maybe on the outside looking in, and then all of a sudden you get on the inside and it's like, whoa, like things are a little different. How did you realize, that when you first walked into the Benfold that there was there was some serious issues you had to address?
Well, the day I took command is a big ceremony that takes about 90 minutes. Band comes, everybody in their direct flights. And when my predecessor was leaving the ship for the final time with his parents and his wife and his kids, and as his departure was announced on the public address system, my new crew stood and cheered at the fact that he was leaving. And in my entire career, I had never heard of or seen such a blatant sign of disrespect.
Yeah.
The first thought that went through my mind was, what do I have to do to keep that from happening to me 2 years from now when I leave this ship? And the second thought that went through my mind was, I'm not here to be liked anyway, not part of my job description. Delivering excellence is. Keeping my sailors safe is. Keeping my fellow citizens safe is my job description. And so from that day forward, I stopped worrying about my next promotion. And instead, it was solely about performance and keeping my sailors safe. And that's what drove me each and every day, is what we're doing additive to improving performance and keeping us safe. And if it's not, we're not going to participate in it.
So one question I want to ask you is, when you walk in there, the Navy, it would sound like, there was certain practices, like you say, that were kind of accepted in terms of, look, you kind of did what you were told, and you were you were different in terms of how you went about it. And I'm just wondering, is that something you knew going in and saying, look, this is a leadership style I want to apply based on some sort of playbook? I know you also had mentors in the past on leaders that you really had looked up to, which are referenced in the book. So was it something you had a playbook going in to say, look, this is what I want to do? Or was it more like, what, I need to kind of figure this out as I go along and follow it that way? Which was it, Mike? Was it, again, you kind of knew what you're going in, or was it, what, I need to kind of feel my way out and figure out things as I go along?
Seeing my predecessor getting sheared off was a life-altering moment for me. No, seriously.
Yeah.
In a moment, I also thought, gee, as I came up through the ranks and I got transferred from one job to the next, I wonder how many of my sailors secretly knew or secretly cheered that I was leaving. And I did not know the answer to the question. So that meant I was not as self-aware as I needed to be. And so the bigger question is, what if I had gone on to a great ship and relieved a great commanding officer? Would I have changed? And the answer is, I don't know the answer to the question. I may have led the same way I always led. So the situation forced me to adapt and to try new things and to create an organization that, just didn't blindly follow orders, but one where we were intellectually curious and that we knew that we could challenge processes and procedures to get to the next higher level. So it was all about creating an intellectually curious workforce, and also one that was free of fear. There was tremendous fear and people never surfaced issues. And if I don't know there's an issue, how can I help you fix it?
Yeah.
So replace fear with respect, where people respected each other so much and respected the organization so much that if they saw something, they felt comfortable to raise their hand, and they knew they wouldn't get their head chopped off, but rather, okay, you have our support. Let's figure out how we're going to fix this.
And is the first step in that process listening? Like you had mentioned, you went through and interviewed every single crew member on the Benfold, and you probably spent, most of that time listening to what they were saying. But so is the first step really listening? And what are the type of questions you're trying to ask during that process, during the kind of listening and understanding phase?
So they were very rudimentary. They weren't interrogations, they were just conversations. I had an index card for every sailor, and I had a photo for every sailor, and I would staple that photo to the index card. And in the conversations, I got to know where they were from, their families, what their goals were while they were in the Navy. I would ask them, what are you most proud of in your life that nobody on this ship knows anything about? And if you want to find a window into somebody's soul, find out what they're most proud of, and then you can use that to connect with them. I've got a neighbor, I played tennis with him 2 or 3 weeks ago, and he was curious as to what I did on the ship and what I do now. And I told him, I would ask the question, what are you most proud of? And then I turned it on him and I said, well, what are you most proud of? And it took him 30 seconds of thought. He said, I'm most proud of my loyalty and trustworthiness. And now, armed with that information, if I was his boss, and if something didn't work out, I would never, ever challenge his loyalty or trustworthiness, because that's what he takes the most pride in. So it would give me a way to connect with him in the future that didn't involve challenging his trustworthiness. And so after every interview, I'd write down what I learned. And then when I had a free moment, I would just flip through my index cards. And that's how I got to know the name of every sailor, their job, their face, what they were most proud of, so that helped me engage them better and let them know that I care about them. And when your people know that you care about them, they're going to follow you into battle.
Yeah. Yeah, you have a lot of great stories, and I think give us some perspective as well on how that translates in the corporate world. Because every time I would finish one of your chapters in your book, I would reflect on myself and say, okay, how does that chapter then reflect into the corporate world? Because it might not be a perfect fit. Maybe some of them don't, completely fit in, but listening, I think, actually does fit in. I'd be keen to know, when you go in and help companies and try and, help them with their culture, presumably it also starts with listening. But maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but give us some perspective on kind of how listening translates in the corporate world and what you see on maybe similarities and differences compared to how it worked on the Benfold.
Well, in the interviews, I would tell my sailors, I don't care what your age is, I don't care what your rank is, and I don't care how long you've been here. You can come to work every day and challenge every process and every procedure. And if you have an idea how to improve something 1%, I want to hear from you. And so we could grand slam. It was about incremental improvement every day, and knowing the crew, knowing that if they had an idea, that we would listen to them. And sometimes, sometimes they gave me great ideas. Sometimes they gave me lousy ideas. Sometimes there were ideas in the middle. And I would say, I like where you're going with this, but here are my objections. If you can overcome my objections, come back and knock on my door. And some of our best ideas came when I, said, here are my objections. And they went back to work and really thought through what they were proposing and how to get to a higher level. And the other questions I asked, what do you like most about this ship? What do you like least? And what would you change if you were the captain? And of course, rule number one is you can't change the captain. But, if they gave me a great idea, man, I'll implement it right on the spot. And so that listening is what enabled me to understand how to do things better. But also the listening helped me to understand where the areas of opportunity were that we need to improve on. And so I bet you 50 or 60% of my day was spent either listening or communicating back to them where we're going and why it's in their own best interest. And so what, I do, when businesses bring me in, for keynotes, it's about getting leaders to realize, they're doing pretty darn well or they wouldn't be there.
Yep.
But this is about controlling your own destiny. No organization's future is guaranteed on this planet. You got to go out and fight for it every day. And just getting by is not the same as being great and controlling your own destiny. And that's what's at stake. And so you've got to up your game as a leader. Young people today know what their friends are getting in other work environments. And so they have higher standards and expectations of us. And if we want them to up their game, we got to up our game as leaders.
I couldn't agree with you more. And to add on what you're saying, and I'd just love to get your perspective on it as well, is that technology is rapidly changing, and perhaps it's changing faster than it changed in the 90s, just in terms of how quickly we've got, AI and a whole bunch of things on the fly. The reality is the people that might understand that the best are actually the young folks. They might actually understand, how to leverage technology a lot better than folks like me who have been around the block for maybe too long. And it's not to me, it's more important than ever now to be listening to the younger folks, because in this world of rapid technological change where you're looking at ways to leverage technology to do things quicker, you should be listening to everybody. And perhaps the younger folks who just graduated school might be the most actually important voice in the entire room.
Absolutely. And and so we've got to be flexible enough to understand that they have a different viewpoint and that we need to see the organization through their eyes. And what drove this home for me was I was out walking around the ship one day and I came across the sailor and he says, Captain, this ship is like a tree full of monkeys. You're the monkey at the top of the tree. On every branch, there's different levels of monkeys, and we're the monkeys in the bottom branch. He said, whenever you look down top of the tree, all you ever see are smiling faces coming back at you. When we look up from the bottom branch, we have an entirely different view of the organization. So that hit home because when that sailor said that to me, it hit me. I've got a multicultural organization. I've got a multi-generational organization, and USS Benfold was the first ship built for the Navy from the keel up to accommodate both men and women, and each group speaks a different language. And so I realized I'm communicating in my language and not communicating to them in the language that they understand. And just like when you go out and sell to a customer, you have to communicate to them in the language that they understand, why it's in their own best interest. And you want to make them look good to their organization. And so if you make your customer look good within their organization, they're going to become more loyal and dedicated and committed to you. And if they end up changing companies, guess what? They're going to bring you with them. And so that's, kind of like the way I've operated is I've always tried to make my boss look good, and then my boss will take care of me. But since I left the Navy and I wrote It's Your Ship, the publisher thought I might sell 20,000 copies, if I bought the first 10,000. And I did a lot of things that changed the way we sell books here in the US. And one of them was the CEO of Barnes & Noble, our largest bookseller here in the US, asked me to come speak to his store managers. And at my own expense, I flew to Phoenix. I bought every Barnes & Noble store manager a copy of It's Your Ship, and they liked it so much they went back to their stores and told their sales associates, if somebody buys a business book, recommend It's Your Ship to them. And in 23 years, I've sold over 1.5 million copies. And on a per capita basis, my book is more popular in Canada than it is in the United States.
Really? Wow.
I've never spent one more dime in marketing other than buying those store managers the book. And so the key is, your best marketing is a satisfied client. And that's how you get more and more business, and that's how you get your clients to be more dedicated and committed to you. And so, I don't spend a dime on marketing.
One of the chapters that stood out in the book is recognition. And, I think it kind of links back to what you're saying. You tell the story in the book on some of the unique ways of recognizing staff members. And the story you tell in the book is actually sending a letter to their parents about, about all the great things that they've done. And I can imagine, I'm not aware of any company that's ever done that before. But how'd you get that idea? And maybe just tell like a story about, because again, you tell a story in the book where someone showed up in tears in your office because he kind of had this fractured relationship with his father, and you send a letter. That person, I would assume that got, that came to your office that person would probably run through a wall for you at this point. You know what I mean? Like literally, like again, because again, how long did that letter take to draft? You know, maybe a little bit of time, but the lifelong connection you have with that person is forever, right?
And with their parents.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
So, prior to getting command of the ship, I worked for the U.S. Secretary of Defense, and I was an individual contributor. And between me and him is a 3-star general. And as part of my self-coaching program, whenever the general would go in for a private conversation, I would stand in the doorway listening to that private conversation. I called it intelligence gathering.
Huh.
I was 34 at the time, general's late 50s. Goes in to see the secretary, and he asked the secretary how Mike did on this project. And the Secretary of Defense looked up, not knowing I was standing outside the door, and he said, "Paul, Mike did great. I consider you and him interchangeable." And may have been a little bit of a slam on him, but it was a huge boost for me. And what it did was gave me validation. And what it enabled me to do was to have more confidence when I went out to be a ship captain.
Yep.
In the Navy, we have a knack for tearing people down. And what the Secretary of Defense taught me was the value of building people up. And so when I realized how critical that recognition was in my confidence and my career development, when I got to the ship, it's like, I'm going to give that same recognition to my crew. Instead of tearing them down, I'm going to build them up. And I
Yeah.
can't, the more I can't give them bonuses. But you know what I can do? Catch them doing something great. I told my 5 department heads, if somebody does something great, use me as a tool in your toolkit. Come tell me about it and I'll search them out. It'll make you look good in their eyes as well. I'm here to help you. And so what we were about was the recognition and calling people out and reprimanding in private or correcting in private, but praising in public. And I have one form of formal recognition. It's called a Navy Achievement Medal. And it's important to sailors because if they get a bonus point on their advancement exam, I'm authorized to give out 15 of these medals a year. So I would walk around the ship with medals in my pocket. And if I saw a sailor doing something great, I'd put a medal on his or her chest right on the spot, thank them for going the extra mile. And as I told you, I'm authorized to give out 15 of these a year. I figured nobody at the Bureau of Naval Personnel was tracking how many medals I was giving out. In my first command, I gave out 115 Navy Achievement Medals. It's like, what are you going to do to me? You going to fire me? Recognizing I'm, or it's not going to happen. So, life on a ship is very difficult, especially for the married family members to be gone for 6, 7, 8 months. And so I always tried to figure out a way to keep the spouses and the families informed as to what was going on. And I would send birthday cards to the spouses of my married sailors. It was a stupid pre-printed card. The officers and crew of USS Benfold wish you a happy birthday. Handwrite Dear Marie at the top, sign it Love Mike at the bottom. P.S. Your husband or wife is doing great. Even if they weren't, I put that on every darn birthday card. So anyway, I did something for the married sailors. What can I do for the single sailors? So then I think back to my own experience when I was 22 years old, how my parents would have loved to have gotten a letter from my commanding officer telling them that I was doing something great. So I decided if a sailor does something great, I'm going to send a letter to their parents. And I had a project, 5 sailors were working on it. They did outstanding. And 4 of them were good, upstanding sailors. And 1 was marginal and, not a solid contributor. And I sent a letter to the parents of the other 4, and I obsessed for 2 weeks, the stupid stuff that I obsess over. Should I send his parents a letter? And finally I said, I'm going to do it. And his parents were divorced. I sent 2 letters, 1 to each parent. And 2 weeks later, the sailor comes back, knocks on my door with tears streaming down his eyes. And he said, for my whole life, my father told me I was going to be a failure. And he just called me to congratulate me on doing well in this project. And he said, I just want to say thank you. So you never know, what baggage people carry with them through life.
Mm-hmm.
And this kid never had it in his ability to be a grand slam hitter. But you know what? He started hitting singles. And if you give me a team where everybody hits a single, I'm going to the World Series.
Absolutely. That's a great story.
And
I think the other
and
thing too is you don't necessarily realize, like, you were the captain of the ship, and maybe you didn't necessarily realize the impact that you can have on the younger folks. Because again, you tell the story of the monkeys at the top of the tree. You know, when you look down and consider yourself, you might not look down and consider yourself in the same way the folks are looking up at you. You know, it's almost like they're looking up at you with such reverence. You know what I mean? Like, this is the captain of the ship. Whereas for yourself, you might not actually realize the impact that you have. You know what I mean? And for some father getting a letter from the captain of the USS Benfold, you know, and again, for anybody outside the, you know, in civilian life like us, we'd be, you know, like who gets a letter like that? You know what I mean? Like, it's like
right.
this bolt of lightning that hits them, right? And you don't necessarily realize that if you're the captain. You know what I mean? You might not unless you really go through and think about it. You know what I mean? So that's a great story.
Well, it was based on what I think my own parents would have wanted. And so we talk about how to create a great culture. I'm a very simple person. To me, a great culture is would you want your son or daughter to come work for you and see you in action every day? And if you're proud, you're on the right track. And if you're embarrassed, fix it. And all I did was to fix everything that I was embarrassed about so that I would want my own family members to come be a part of that organization.
And I just wondering too, is that when you talk to companies, have you seen companies pick up some of those elements of recognition? Any good ideas from the company side? Have they done the same thing? Because again, I could imagine a senior executive writes a letter to the kid's parents or something like that. Again, that could have a similar type of impact. I'm just wondering how, in the world of recognition, how that translates into the corporate world.
If you ask me, the best led organization in the US today, it's Delta Airlines.
Really? Okay.
Absolutely. And the employee it has 100,000 employees. Every one of them calls the CEO Ed. And Ed is beloved in the organization. And it's about how they treat people. And everybody at every level, every manager at every level is about treating those flight attendants, those aircraft mechanics, those baggage handlers with respect and dignity. And Delta is the most profitable airline in the US, and it's the best airline in the United States. And it's a culture that the guy at the top has set, and they revere this CEO, and people get emotional. So I've had the opportunity to not only know a lot of Delta employees, but also speak to them, a couple of times. But they get emotional when they talk about their connection to the airline. And I'm here thinking, this is one of the toughest industries in the world to be in, is the airline.
Absolutely.
Because I've flown 6.5 miles since I got out of the Navy 25 years ago. I hate the traveling public. You know, it's not glamorous to travel anymore. And these people have a thankless job, but man, they are emotionally connected to their work. And I take it back to the CEO and the connection and how he communicates with them. So it can be done. Especially, Delta Airlines operates all around the world. And, some supervisors never see the flight attendants that they're supervising. So it's kind of like a remote business, but Delta Airlines shows that it can be done.
Yeah.
And they consistently rate in the top 100 places to work in America.
So, let's, you take Delta as an example. The Benfold would be another example. You come back and say, well, Mike, I love everything you say about empowering people to make decisions, but if someone puts in the wrong screw in an airline, in an airplane, the plane's going to go, the plane could go down. If someone does something wrong on the Benfold, something bad could happen. I can't trust anybody to do it. Now, in your book, you talk a lot about breaking out certain decisions and having kind of, maybe some guardrails. Give us some perspective and say, because if I already come to you and say, Mike, I don't trust my employees to do that stuff, so therefore everything they want to do, they got to run it by me. I think that's the best way to do things, because things could go bad quickly. Maybe you could just tell me why that's probably not the best way to go about my business.
I had my line in the sand. if what you were doing could kill somebody, injure somebody, waste taxpayers' money, or do damage to the ship, you can't go there without me. But if what you're doing runs short of my line in the sand, you are empowered to step up to the plate and take action. And the only way the people on the front line are going to learn is to be trained and let them do it. And the manager or the owner isn't going to be there for forever.
Yep.
And if they leave and not transfer their wisdom and knowledge to their teams, then they are doing themselves and their organization a disservice. And where I come from, I have seen ships literally fall apart the day the commanding officer gets transferred. And it's because he or she had to make every decision and nobody else was empowered to make decisions. And when the head guy left, the whole ship just crumbled in performance. And so I often think that a person's final evaluation should be written a year after they leave the job. And instead of a short-term metric to just when you're retiring or leaving, we'll figure out your evaluation a year from now after we see how strong an organization you left behind. And then that would be in their best interest to train and develop and to delegate and to hold people accountable instead of micromanaging and making every decision on their own.
Yeah, one of my favorite chapters in your book is when you talk about how you exited the Navy and the mixed emotions you had. Like when you left the Benfold continued to outperform. You talk about, certain exercises that it did and it knocked it out of the park. And at that time, I think the way you describe it in the book is you kind of had mixed emotions on how you felt. It's like, man, like, you know, these guys came up through me, like it's still there. And then you kind of came to the realization that, you know what, you should actually feel really proud about what you did because you built a culture that can sustain without Mike there. And you should be incredibly proud of that. And having somebody a leader who has the foresight to think like that, I don't know how many of those leaders there are, but but again, that would be a challenge too, and trying to find somebody who can actually be that forward thinking because it's easier said than done, I guess you could say. But give us some perspective on when you left and kind of those mixed emotions because I thought that was actually quite interesting how you were feeling when you left.
Well, it tore me apart emotionally to leave because, this is my baby.
Yeah.
But when in my last year on the ship, we were awarded the Spokane Trophy, which is the award for best ship in the Pacific Fleet. And in years 3 and 4 after I left, Benfold won the Battenberg Cup 2 years in a row for being the best ship in the entire U.S. Navy. So it was in my best interest to leave the organization so that it could run without my replacement. And coming back to, the book that you're referencing, Kill the Leader. In my last year in command, I was irrelevant to the operation of the ship.
Yeah. There's no better compliment.
Everything was running in automatic. And what that enabled me to do was to do what if scenarios. And so I would think through scenarios that we might see in the future so that we could prepare to meet them. And instead of reacting, we're going to be proactive and lead it. And so if I'm bogged down in day-to-day micromanaging, I don't have the bandwidth to do the what-if scenarios of what the future is going to hold and how do I prepare the organization to meet those scenarios. And so, I was rooting. I wanted Benfold to succeed. The guy who replaced me went on to be a 3-star. The guy who replaced him went on to be a 2-star. The guy who replaced him went on to be a 4-star and became the chief of naval operations. And so, and it was because, that crew made them look good. And the crew made me look good too. I'm here today because, they performed in such an outstanding manner. And I give them credit, for my success.
And did you, when you had this succession, did you have to tell the new person coming on to say, look, this is how we roll here? Like, this isn't like, you're going to come in and start telling people what to do and all this, like all the work that you've done over the last, 2 years, it's got to sustain. And did that new leader immediately get on board with how you were doing things? Like, it wasn't an accident that Benfold all of a sudden was the best performing ship in the Navy. There was very specific reasons, and you better not screw with success, because you better not screw with the culture, because that's really what's driving this. And I'm just
So
wondering, how were those conversations?
at the time, the way succession worked, a person would transfer in from outside the ship. We didn't fleet up internally. And it's my last night in command. I'm on my bridge wing chair watching my final sunset. And this gentleman who transferred in to replace me comes up to me and said, "For the first time in my career, I'm intimidated about taking over an assignment." He said, "I don't want to be the one known to cause Benfold to go downhill." And he said, "What do I need to do?" I said, "You need to change." Because he
Wow.
grew up in the engineering ranks, and engineers have a history of beating their people over the head with a crowbar to get things done. And that's what his reputation was, a fire breather. And I said, "Look, they want to win just as badly as you do. Don't ever challenge their motives. Interview them the way I did. Get to know them, engage them better. Take an interest in their promotion and their advancement, and they'll take an interest in yours." And I said, "Keep this culture going where they don't fear telling you the truth." And to his credit, he changed, and the ship continued to excel.
And when you help companies in the corporate world, is it hard to find leaders who kind of have the bigger picture, like you say, who aren't micromanaging and are trying to focus on the what ifs and developing people, or where those leaders are few and far between, and again, you're there to help them? Or do you find that it's the reverse, and that that maybe those folks are in the minority, the command and control? But just give us some perspective on the corporate world and what you've seen.
Command and control is definitely on the decline because there's a war for talent out there, and the talented do not want to work in that type of environment. So I'm finding enormous response to people wanting to change and become better. And I genuinely think they are. They're becoming more enlightened. And so, yeah, so what I try to do is to just give them nuggets of things they can do even better, to get to the next higher level, and how to create that accountability and collaboration within your organization.
The other, you also have another chapter in the book, and it's not just one chapter, it's probably littered throughout the book, is the importance of having fun. You have a lot of stories about that. Maybe just talk about the Benfold, is why it was so important to have fun. And then the second part to my question is, how does that translate into into the corporate world? And maybe, I don't know, any good examples you've seen about having fun, but maybe just starting with the Benfold, why was it so important for the guys and the girls to have fun on the ship?
Because people are working hard, and if all work and no enjoyment, it becomes drudgery. And so in the interviews, the sailor said to me, "Why don't we buy a stereo system? And every Thursday night we're at sea, set it up on the flight deck, listen to jazz, and watch the sunset." And I thought, great idea. We bought the finest sound system money can buy. First Thursday night, we're out there listening to jazz, watching the sunset. And the sailor comes up to me and says, "This is cool, but it'd be cooler if we could smoke cigars while listening to jazz and watching the sunset." Now, we had to be I'm not going to lie, we had to be the best at everything we did, including smoking the best cigars the world had to offer. And there's a problem in that we're not allowed to buy them inside the United States. You can buy them in Toronto, but you can't buy them here. So
Hmm.
when it pulled into a foreign port, we'd load the ship out with cigars from this country I'm not authorized to mention still.
Hmm. I know
And
what you're talking about.
we had a humidor in our ship store. And every Thursday night, men and women would stand on that flight deck, smoking cigars, listening to jazz, watching the sunset, and creating a bond. And what that did was we were siloed among the 5 departments. And when everybody's out there having fun, talking across departmental lines, the silos come down and collaboration increases. So that's what having fun was about, was to help break down the silos and stop the finger pointing, and instead, work with your buddy that you just had a cigar with to solve a problem.
And I got to ask you one question. Have you come around on the country music, Mike? I know you had a specific rule on country music. Maybe you could outline that rule, as you've maybe aged a little bit more and perhaps gotten your music taste maybe have expanded. I'm interested to know, have you come around on country music, or does the Mike rule from the 90s still apply to today where the country music is kind of off limits?
So one sailor says, "Why don't we have happy hour?" And I can't serve alcohol on the ship at sea, but we could have happy hour every other Friday night. We'd serve buffalo wings, shrimp, steamship round is a first class event. And we bought a karaoke machine. And there were only two rules on karaoke night. One was the captain was not authorized to sing. And the second one was there would be no country music on my ship. And if I were still captain today, there would still be no country music.
Really?
But to show you how adaptable I am, there would be chill house music or house music, but no country music.
What about the first rule? Have you bended on that one? Would it be okay for the captain now to participate in the karaoke, or is that still off limits as well? No.
I still won't sing. No.
Now the other thing too, is picking which rules to break versus which rules to follow. Because again, you broke some rules, and I just wondered, but there were certain rules, like you say, the rules about alcohol, where again, those are very strict. Give us some perspective on maybe, some rules are okay to break. You know what I mean?
So I don't advocate breaking rules. I advocate understanding the intent of the regulation and then figuring out how to make it work best for you. And so you never do anything that could get you fired. Inappropriate relationships, running the ship aground, getting somebody killed, abuse of your financial responsibility. And those are things you can get fired for. So you have to be, know those things and never cross that line. But other regulations or guidelines that were made for a specific reason years ago, and sometimes situations change and regulations can't change fast enough. So I would always try to understand the intent of the directive and then make sure I was complying with the intent, but then applying my own common sense on how to accomplish something within those guidelines. And so never do anything you can get fired for. Everything else you can improve upon. So instead, I don't consider myself breaking the rules. I consider myself improving them.
You agree with sometimes it's easier to beg for forgiveness than ask for permission? Are you an advocate of that? Because when you were talking about like that, certainly they got to pick and choose. Like I said, there's certain ones where, certain offenses are not forgivable. You know what I mean? And result in your firing. But is that kind of a reasonable principle to follow in some cases?
So we have a wonderful acronym. It's called UNODIR, UNODIR. It stands for unless otherwise directed. So on things that could be contentious, I'd send an email to my chain of command. Unless otherwise directed, this is what I intend to do.
I see.
And it gave them the opportunity to shoot me down, and they never did. Yeah. Because all you want to know is that your people are handling an issue.
Yep.
And as long as you know they're handling the issue, you'll be left alone. And so what I wanted my chain of command to know, I'm handling this issue. This is how I'm doing it. I'm not breaking any rules or regulations. And they said, okay, go do it. We'll go focus on somebody else who isn't doing it properly. And so just keep your chain of command informed, and they'll leave you alone. To me, I call it the American dream. Never hearing from your boss. Feed information to your boss. They won't call you. And if you don't hear from your boss every day, man, it's a good day.
You go back to decentralization. I totally agree with you. I think, the boss is not there to micromanage at all. So,
Right.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yep.
Well, Mike, the book is, It's Your Ship, Management Techniques from the Best Damn Ship in the Navy. I would highly recommend. We've just barely scratched the surface on some of the stories and things. The book's, got tons of great stories that can be applied directly into the corporate world. But Mike, thanks very much for taking the time. And for those that would be interested in trying to get in touch with you, because again, you consult and help companies all over the world. how can people get in touch with you? And what is the typical, when do companies typically reach out and say, look, Mike, we need some help here?
So my website is apgleadership.com. And my email is mabrashoff@apgleadership.com. But it's curious, the companies that hire me are not the ones that need help. It's the companies that want to get to the next higher level. And so it's usually the top 20% of the companies that bring me in to get that edge, to put them over the top. So that's typically who I speak for.
Yeah, and that's a pretty good client base. Ones that have read your book, agree with all the principles in your book, and are just, how do we take this up to the next to the next level?
Exactly.
And yeah, that's a pretty good set of clients to have in
Good.
your Rolodex there, Mike. But
Yes.
but again, thanks again for taking the time. We really appreciate having the conversation today. But thank you very much.
You got it, Scott. And take care, folks. Have a good week.